This podcast is made possible by the generous support of the American people through the United States Agency for International Development. The content of this podcast are the sole responsibility of its creators and does not necessarily reflect the views of USAID or the United States government.
Welcome to our second episode of the WABiLED podcast series. Today, we will be looking at armed conflict and natural resources. So this is an exciting period for us to be doing these podcasts, as we are welcoming here in Accra 30 persons, professionals in the protection of endangered species from across Africa, 15 of whom are from the ECOWAS sub-region. And they will be doing a master's degree on CITES. Now, CITES is the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species of Wild Fauna and Flora. And these 30 Africans will be learning how to implement the CITES Convention in their countries and in this region. Here with us in the studio is Professor Terry Sunderland, who is the Director of International Cooperation and Engagement at the University of British Columbia's Faculty of Forestry. Also here with us is Mr. Ulysse Korogone, who happens to be the CITES focal point for Benin and is also the National Chief of Service for Legislation and Forest Conservation. I am Michael Balinga, lead for combating wildlife trafficking at the West Africa Biodiversity and Low Emissions Growth. That is a 4-year USAID program working with ECOWAS and its 15 member states. So, welcome to this program. We are going to look at a couple of points about the recent happenings in West Africa that relate natural resource management and armed conflict. First of all, I would be interested in looking at how armed conflict has influenced wildlife and forest communities. Professor Sunderland, would you like to share some of your knowledge on that aspect?
Yeah, that's a good question, Mike, or a good lead into the discussion. Essentially, one thing that we often forget is forests are repositories of things that people need: food, shelter, medicines. And what we've seen historically is during some of the conflicts in West Africa, in Sierra Leone and Liberia, you see armed groups retreat into the forest because they get the cover from the tree canopy. They have access to forest foods, hamlets, enclave communities within those forest environments. They don't need hospitals because there's traditional healers, traditional medicines are able to treat whatever wounds and injuries they incur during their activities. And also, obviously, not just forest foods, but bushmeat as well. So it's kind of a no-brainer that you would, as an armed group, if you wanted to conceal yourselves, you would retreat into the forest, into that forest environment. And we've seen that, repeatedly through armed conflicts in West, Central, and East Africa.
And I guess we're getting a lot of these kinds of issues recently, especially in West Africa. So, Ulysse, would you like to give us one or two specific examples from the most recent conflict in Benin and how it happened?
Thank you very much, Michael. Are you right? Benin is faced of this situation since 2019, and our national parks are frequently face of this conflict. And a few days ago, 5 of the soldiers in the national park of Penjai were died. So it's very important for us to look at this situation and see how this situation impact our conservation actions for the species.
So this situation impacts conservation action, but does it also impact the communities around the national parks? And does it also impact the rangers who are working for the national park?
Yeah, of course. Armed conflict has known to have a negative impact on conservation since long time. And for community, for the daily work, the daily livelihood, they need to enter in the park. They need to work in secure environment. So with armed conflict, they can't do that. And by the other hand, today the material used for these attacks is local materials. It's not the sophisticated material. So that means maybe that within the community today, we may have some people who can make this kind of material, and we can start thinking about that. We don't have it in the past, but now they are using local material to make this attack.
So if the communities are beginning to use local materials to carry out attacks from the national parks, it looks to me like this is getting beyond just the simple issues of poaching. Would you agree with me, Terry? And what can the international community do to try to manage these kinds of issues?
I think there's a couple of interesting points here. The current model of conservation where we preserve protected areas, I'm not going to say conserve, but the general model is that we consider these areas prime and pristine wildernesses. They should be protected at all costs. And we expect that protection to come it becomes the responsibility of the rangers concerned. Now, there's a sort of human ethical conservation conundrum here because, so for example, in Virunga, there are 800 mountain gorillas. Yet over the last 15 years, 160 rangers have been killed protecting those gorillas. Now, of course, you become a ranger because it's a paying job, it's employment, it gives you job security to a degree, but it's also incredibly risky. So is it justifiable for us as conservationists or wishing to protect those species? Is it justifiable asking people to put their lives on the line in the way that they do? And I think that's a question that needs to be asked, particularly when some of these landscapes are subject to real conflict. In the Virunga, it's, the militias of Eastern DRC. We've seen the issues in Benin, for example. So these rangers are putting their lives on the line and risking their very lives for the protection of species that we are concerned about. So is there another model that we need to think about in terms of protecting those species while also maintaining, as was pointed out, the livelihoods of people who need access to those forest resources, as I mentioned earlier, for fuel wood, for food, for medicines, for whatever it might be. So there are so many layers to this discussion that need to be had.
And I think, Ulysse, these layers actually are determined or defined by the policies that we have in place. So some of these policies are national and others are regional. Would you like to share with us some of the policies that ECOWAS, for instance, is trying to put in place to deal with wildlife crime, or some of the policies in Benin that perhaps may have a bearing on these issues, or what needs to be done?
Okay, thank you, Michael. I think at regional level, ECOWAS has set setting a strategy to combat wildlife crime. And this strategy will include all the efforts doing at national level and all the effort doing with other organizations. So this is a good point that can be used to combat this situation. Also in national level, as you see yesterday, I think all the ministry impacted by this situation in West Africa met in Cotonou. They met and they will talk about this situation to define a new policy, new action to do in order to have a better view or better conservation action for our protected areas in link to this securitized situation we have now.
So that's at the national level and the regional level. But I guess that where these things happen more are probably in the protected areas that are close to boundaries.
Yes.
So that means that we need transboundary agreements in place, and we need to have a system for coordinating the enforcement and protection of people and wildlife. Yeah. And I just wonder, Terry, do you have any ideas on how that should happen?
Yeah, I mean, that's a fantastic point. You're exactly spot on. And in many of those forest frontiers that are transboundary, the government services are often replaced by conservation NGOs. The government often has very limited presence in many of these forest frontier sites. So the opportunistic ability for militias and other armed groups to enter those areas fairly unmolested is high. So basically all you have in terms of policing and regulation are the NGOs, the game guards, maybe one or two government equivalents, counterparts, etc. But these are usually fairly lawless, uncontrolled, and unregulated areas. But I just wanted to go back to a point, and I'm sure you'll bring this up anyway in the discussion. We're dealing with the blunt end of conservation, if you like, the protection of species. And you mentioned CITES species, so let's take elephants, for example. In the brief that you provided before this podcast, you talked about the numbers of elephants killed in Babangida in Cameroon, in Benin and elsewhere. They're killed for a reason. There's a market for that ivory. Now, the question is, if you're integrating CITES regulations, why aren't we dealing with the other end of that value chain? Why aren't we stopping that illegal trade and getting that regulated at the sharp end, the purchasing end? So it's not just a discussion about, I guess, the conservation sort of subtleties and what we can do on the ground and how many AK-47s we provide our rangers. How do we stop that value chain from creating that pressure on the ground in the first place? And what can we do to encourage national governments not to shy away from those forest frontiers and to actually make sure that there's regulation, there's government presence, there's accountability and infrastructure? So, we talked about layers earlier. So we've got all these different things happening that create a sort of perfect storm for the sort of things that happened in Benin last week and happen constantly in other protected areas in Africa.
So, Ulysse, would you say it's about reducing demand for these wildlife products, but it's also about making sure that the communities that live where the resources are also have enough livelihood opportunities and options so that they are not tempted to become part of the problem?
Yeah, it's really exactly what I meant is we need to find solution for the community. This is a new thing we have to deal with. So we have to find our solution, how to include community, to include their needs. How can we do to don't make them part of this problem? So we have to think about that. Why not? This situation, we cannot catch this situation very well. We need to work with the communities. It's very important because if our poacher they are used to use local material. Even the gun is a local gun, something like that. But if now, because we have criminals come somewhere else and stay with them, because they are used to stay within the community first before entering in the national park. So if they stay with them and now they show to the community how to make this kind of materials, and they don't have any other solution, they will start using this kind of material even for poaching, even for other things, not only to make an attack or terrorist or something like that, just for the activity, illegal activity. So we need really to understand what is going on within the community and how we can use them to better address the solution.
I think that's a fantastic point, and I think essentially the holy grail of what we should be doing. When protected areas are set up and people are excluded, you lose their constituent support. You lose the support of local people. And so they're happy to let poachers in. What needs to happen is that people are not just part of the process. They are the process. Mm-hmm. And they provide, and I can think of examples in areas I've worked, Takamanda in Cameroon, for example. By getting people on board, they can actually be the gatekeepers of that forest area. As you say, the hunters and poachers rely on food, support, other logistics provided by local people. If those local people were encouraged to contribute to that conservation in a meaningful way, they wouldn't provide that support, and they would be the ones controlling access to those forest resources and those animal resources. So conservation through this fortress approach has been quite counterproductive. Yes, you can protect animals, species, whatever we want to protect, and there are some great success stories. We've talked about the mountain gorilla. Populations have increased from 400 20 years ago to 800 to 1,000 now. That, from an individual species perspective, that's a success story. But at what collateral damage has that happened? With the conflicts that go on with indigenous people, the Badwa in particular in Virunga. So the fundamental point I'm trying to make here is that from the very outset, the protected areas need to be much more inclusive and allow people certainly access rights to essential things like food and medicines and firewood. And it can be regulated in a way. You can write management plans that people will adhere to as long as they're sympathetic to their basic livelihood needs. And then once you get them on board, then that's the way that you can actually use them as an added resource to protect the forest resources and everything therein.
So what we are saying basically is that if people don't have the resources that they need for their everyday lives, and if they don't feel that they are included in the management of resources that are around them, and that their families, their ancestors have managed for generations, then they are tempted to become part of the problem. And this problem is not just limited perhaps to forestry resources. Perhaps it's a broader problem of natural resources. I think of the diamond issues in Sierra Leone and Liberia, for example. And I wonder, do you have any thoughts on that, Terry?
I can give you an example from British Columbia, if you like. So I'm a professor at the University of British Columbia, based in Vancouver, and I only moved there 4 years ago, but British Columbia's economy is based on exploitation. And it's about timber. It's about lumber. It's about fisheries. And we see these boom and bust cycles, particularly in fisheries, and there's mining. So the exploitative kind of approach to economic development is flawed. We don't value nature's resources until they've actually gone. And it's the short-term economic value is symptomatic of our, and I hate to say this, our capitalistic society. And we need a fundamental paradigm shift in the way that we think about our relationship with nature. And we've seen over the last 2 years with COVID, for example, how we can reset society to a certain degree. And I think that really surprised me how quickly society was able just to, and everyone was working from home suddenly. No one was going from school. We were doing homeschooling. So it is possible to break down some of these well-entrenched kind of societal habits that need to change. And the last thing we need to do now as we're sort of emerging from lockdown is switch back again, so that we're not thinking about nature. We're not thinking about the resources that we should be protecting, and not just protecting, but actually revering in a way that's much more ingrained into the human fabric, if you like. I know that sounds a bit sort of granola and yoga like, but I don't mean it to. What I'm saying is our relationship with nature needs to be readdressed and rebalanced. And I've been to markets in Southeast Asia, and you see rhino horn for sale, you see ivory for sale, and you just think rhino horn is just keratin. It's the same as your fingernails. Ivory is just some white stuff that is carved into it's just stuff. That's all it is. But the result of that stuff being in the market is creating these horrific human rights abuses and conflicts in the source of origin of many of those species. And so where is CITES? What can CITES do in terms of controlling those markets and the drivers of exploitation that happen in these conflicted landscapes?
So in a sense, what you are saying, Terry, is that if we can get a mind change, behavior change, and we do get to a point where we improve on the natural resource management by changing the way we think and the way we do things, then we might actually be impacting not just the natural resource management, so not just the natural resource sustainability, but also reducing conflicts over these resources.
That's exactly what I'm saying. Yes, yeah, I think so. And I think that it's become such a societal problem that the haves versus the have-nots, and we've seen over the last 2 years, the disparity between rich and poor has become incredibly large. I mean, when I was a kid, we didn't have multi-billionaires, or there weren't so many of them, let's put it that way. But everybody wants to be like that. So the consumerism that drives much of societal action is a mimic of everyone wants to be, the rich kids of Instagram kind of thing. And that's wrong, but that drives this kind of illegal trade because people want stuff and it is about stuff. So I think we need to reset, and I think it's perfectly possible. Protecting these species, put some money in. This is the real frustration. And you and I, Mike, we've both worked on projects in protected areas. They're under-resourced, under-financed. We struggle with capacity in terms of human capacity, skill sets. And how do you expect small NGOs with a limited budget to replace government institutions to protect these species in these forest frontiers. So it needs investment, it needs capacity, and the kind of thing that you're doing is fantastic. You're getting transboundary cooperation going on in West Africa. That's exactly what should be happening.
Yeah, I get the point you're making, Terry. And Ulysse, I was just wondering, listening to the things Terry has said, it sort of tells us that we as the forestry sector cannot solve these problems alone. Yes. There are security issues, there are poverty issues, there are knowledge issues. There's a whole lot of sectors that perhaps need to get involved. There are also military and security issues. So perhaps you want to be able to say something about how do we get all these different sectors to engage, each to do something about different aspects, so the layers Terry mentioned of the problem.
Well, you are right, Michael. We need to find a multi-sector solution for this situation. We cannot fight against this situation alone, like ranger or forester. We have to include not only at national level, sector at national level, but also all the sector at regional and international level to address transboundary aspect of the problem. So I think you did well, you say well about what we have to do. So we have to work together to find this situation, and to find this situation we need to check, we need to look at, and as Terry said, we need even with scientific view, we have to look at this situation and to see what has happened, and maybe to address the answer by including all the sector that we maybe needed.
And do you think we've made this point enough to our leaders at the national level and the regional level that it needs to be a multi-sectoral approach? I mean, you are about to do a master's degree, and I think your topic, your research is linked to understanding the challenges, the criminal activities, but also security issues and the livelihood and conservation issues. So it seems to me that you are thinking in your thesis of looking at this multifaceted approach to addressing natural resource management problems.
Yes, of course. Once this situation comes more frequently, I would like to ask to see if we can look at this situation more deeply, to see what kind of solution and what kind of approaches we can put together to face this situation. So I don't have right answer now, because the answer will come out from all we will find on the field, by discussing, by learning from the experience from others, because this situation only on Benin, you have it somewhere else. How do they respond after this kind of situation? How do they address this situation when it's happened in the site? So we have to put all this together to analyze it with scientific view and to propose solution on that.
So I take the keywords of learning. Of analysis and scientific view, so evidence. And Terry, that's what you do. Do you want to tell us how the academic world perhaps could contribute to addressing these issues?
I can try. So I just for context, I've just come down from northern Ghana, where we're working in the Western Wildlife Corridor, and we've just had a massive stakeholder meeting. And the emphasis is moving away from protected areas, not just focusing on protected areas and the importance of wildlife within those areas. It's looking at the broader landscape, because what happens outside of those protected areas obviously impacts. It's a very fluid and dynamic system. And I believe that in order to create that multi sort of sectorial approach, you need to break down the silos between agriculture, forestry, mining, pastoralism, whatever it may be, and get all the stakeholders together, as we did this week, and get them speaking to each other. They're never going to agree. They all have different visions for that landscape, but they can at least appreciate that, hey, you're a pastoral herder. I understand why you need this particular piece of land. Let's compromise and negotiate on my needs and your needs. And taking that landscape scale approach, I think, is a very different and a very it breaks down those silos and sort of makes those sort of boundaries around protected areas more porous. And I don't mean that facetiously. I mean it basically focuses on the broader landscape issues, because wildlife cross landscapes. They don't just cross protected areas. And you have human-wildlife conflict, and you have issues that need to be dealt with, but at the landscape scale. So I think from the academic perspective, we've been responsible for drafting many, many different principles and guidelines as how to do this. The project that I lead now currently is funded by the German government, and it's basically looking at how we operationalize those principles. So we're working in 3 landscapes, one in Ghana, one in Zambia, one in Indonesia, looking at how these fundamental principles of inclusivity, breaking down silos, adaptive management, etc., can all be linked and operationalized in a way. And of the 10 principles, in some landscapes, some are more important than others, and greater weight and emphasis, because all landscapes are different. The context is extremely different. So there's no silver bullet. You still have to know your landscape and know your stakeholders. But breaking down those silos, as was mentioned in Benin, is extremely important for you to get that cross-sectorial kind of collaboration. And I think is really the way forward. And if you look at the development lexicon of the donor community now, they're not talking about PAs. They're talking about this broader landscape scale approach. And our frameworks have been used by USAID, in fact, in Indonesia as an implementation framework for their projects in Borneo and Sumatra and Kalimantan. So there's light, basically, at the end of sometimes a very dark tunnel, and different ways of doing things and different ways of integrating different knowledge systems, traditional systems is also really important too. Sorry, that was a bit of a ramble.
But I do like what you are saying about there being light at the end of the tunnel, and maybe we need to have the courage to not stand in the dark part of the tunnel, but to start walking towards that light. And so perhaps that's the message of hope that we want to part with, and just say that in the WABiLED program that USAID is running, one of the key components or objectives in Objective 2 is about managing these different dynamics at the landscape level. So looking at how transboundary protected areas are managed, involving the communities, but getting even the leaders and managers talking to each other across borders, sharing information on what the problems and the issues are, and together looking for solutions. Perhaps that's what we have not been doing in the past, and perhaps that's what we need to do more of. That's the light that you are talking about, Terry.
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, if we didn't have hope, we wouldn't get up in the morning. And if you consider, I teach undergraduates, but also graduate students. If I can't convey some level of hope, even at my cynical old age, and I've worked in the field for many, many years. I've seen things that work. I've seen things that don't work, but I can't allow myself to be cynical, and I can't convey that to a student body, young, excited professionals who are going to go out there and do it for themselves. They need to be energized and have to believe that there's hope. And I'll give you a really good example. In 1988, when I started my undergraduate, that makes me sound really old. I read, there was a very famous book published by E.O. Wilson called Biodiversity. And there's a chapter in that, and it said, tropical forests going, And I remember reading that, and they projected that by 2000, by the year 2000, nearly all of the tropical forests would be lost around the world. So it was another 12 years projection. Now, I've flown over Borneo, I've flown over Central Africa, and I've flown over Amazonia, and believe me, 8 hours of tree cover, still, it's extremely impressive. So conservation as a discipline has been based on a doomsday scenario. It's all terrible. How are you going to get people to put the money in the box outside the supermarket to support an NGO? We have to present it as a discipline that has hope, and we have solutions to that. Of course, there are problems, but we have to not focus on the problems, but focus on the solutions. Otherwise, there is no hope.
Ulysse, do you any last words along the lines of the perception of hope?
Yeah, I think I'm agree with Terry as he said that if you don't have hope, you are not going to wake up in the morning. You have a lot of things to do, and if we think about these people who are dying in our management plan, our protected areas every day, we have to maintain the hope so that their sacrifice will never come to die. So we need to maintain the hope to put our hand together, our mind together to be sure that we conserve our resources. Not, as he said, it's not going to be lost in 10 years. You have to maintain it for this generation.
Indeed. So I think what brought us here today is the fact that we are having an increasing number of issues with conflict, especially in and around protected areas. This conflict is impacting the natural resources, but also the people who live in the communities around these national parks. And we're not sure that we know how to deal with this, especially the new dynamics of using modern weapons. It's clear that as a sector, the forestry sector, we cannot deal with this alone, and we need to bring in other sectors to work with us. So I would like to leave today with this message that I take from you two of having hope. So including everybody, but daring to hope and working from that hope to build the future that we want. So thank you for being part of this podcast today. And I look forward to us being able to suggest, propose solutions and ideas for making this hope become a reality.